What if I told you that some of the most majestic creatures on Earth were almost completely wiped out by human hands, and then, against every possible odd, they came back? These are the animals that refuse to disappear. Let's start with an animal so iconic it literally appears on a country's national seal. And yet, by the mid-20th century, it was on the brink of vanishing forever. The bald eagle was once an abundant predator across North America. Indigenous peoples had revered it for thousands of years. European settlers, however, saw it very differently. Farmers shot eagles on sight, believing they were a threat to livestock. Hunters killed them for sport and for feathers. The federal government actually paid bounties for dead eagles in Alaska. Over 100,000 birds were killed under that program between 1917 and 1952. Let that number sink in. 100,000 bald eagles, killed because they were considered a nuisance. But hunting wasn't even the final blow. That came in a bottle. The pesticide DDT entered widespread agricultural use after World War II, and it quietly devastated the eagle population in a way that was far harder to see. DDT didn't kill adult eagles outright. It did something more insidious. It thinned the shells of their eggs so severely that nesting females would accidentally crush their own eggs simply by sitting on them. The reproductive cycle essentially collapsed. By 1963, only 417 nesting pairs of bald eagles remained in the contiguous United States. From millions of birds to 417 breeding pairs. The silence in the sky was deafening. Then something remarkable happened. Scientists began connecting the dots between DDT and eggshell thinning. A book called Silent Spring brought the issue to public consciousness. DDT was banned in the United States in 1972. The Endangered Species Act was passed in 1973, giving bald eagles federal legal protection. Breeding programs, nest monitoring, and habitat preservation were all launched in coordination across multiple states. The recovery was slow at first, then almost breathtaking in its acceleration. By 2006, the population had climbed to nearly 10,000 nesting pairs. In 2007, the bald eagle was officially removed from the endangered species list. Today, estimates suggest there are over 300,000 bald eagles living across North America, from 417 pairs to hundreds of thousands of individuals. It is one of the most successful conservation reversals in recorded history, and it happened within a single human lifetime. The sky got its symbol back. Now imagine you are out on the open ocean, and beneath your boat, a creature the length of a school bus is singing. Not communicating in simple clicks, actually composing songs, evolving them over time, passing new melodies across entire ocean basins. Humpback whales do this. And for most of the 20th century, we were killing them by the thousands every single year. Commercial whaling had been practiced for centuries, but the industrial era of whaling that exploded in the early 1900s was something on an entirely different scale. Factory ships could process dozens of whales per day. Explosive harpoons made killing faster and more efficient than ever before. Between 1900 and 1940, an estimated 30,000 humpback whales were slaughtered in the southern hemisphere alone. They were rendered into lamp oil, margarine, machine lubricant, and pet food. By the 1960s, humpback numbers had crashed to perhaps 5,000 individuals worldwide, down from an original global population estimated at 125,000. These weren't animals being accidentally displaced. They were being industrially eliminated. The International Whaling Commission placed humpbacks under protection in 1966. Commercial whaling on humpbacks was largely banned, though some nations continued hunting other species. And here is where the story gets genuinely extraordinary. Unlike many endangered species that require intensive hands-on intervention, captive breeding, feeding programs, habitat engineering, humpbacks essentially just needed humans to stop killing them. The ocean itself did the rest. Over the following decades, humpback populations began recovering at rates that stunned scientists. The South Atlantic population, which had been reduced to just a few hundred individuals, has now rebounded to an estimated 25,000 whales. The North Atlantic and North Pacific populations are both well into the tens of thousands. In 2016, 9 of the 14 recognized humpback whale populations were removed from the endangered species list. Several populations are now considered to have fully recovered to pre-whaling levels. But the story doesn't end with the numbers. Their songs are back too. Researchers have documented humpback whales spreading new song patterns across entire ocean basins, populations in the Pacific teaching each other new compositions within just a few years. The cultural life of these animals, interrupted for decades by slaughter, has resumed. That is not just ecological recovery. That is something deeper. That is a civilization, underwater, healing itself. This next story might be the most staggering wildlife collapse in human history. And it happened not over centuries, but over decades, within a single generation. When European settlers first began moving westward across North America in significant numbers, the Great Plains were home to somewhere between 30 and 60 million bison. 30 to 60 million. They moved in herds so vast that they reportedly took days to pass a single point. Indigenous nations of the plains, the Lakota, Comanche, Cheyenne, and dozens of others, had built entire civilizations around the bison. Every part of the animal was used: meat for food, hides for clothing and shelter, bones for tools, sinew for bowstrings. The bison wasn't just an animal. It was the foundation of an entire way of life. The U.S. government understood this perfectly. And that is why the slaughter of the bison was not merely an economic activity. It was a deliberate military strategy. Army generals openly stated that destroying the bison herds would destroy the resistance of the plains peoples. Hide hunters, sport hunters, and railroad companies all accelerated the killing. The Transcontinental Railroad essentially divided the herd in two and made mass hunting expeditions possible. Some hunters killed hundreds of bison in a single day, taking only the tongue or the hide and leaving the rest to rot. By 1889, fewer than 1,000 bison remained in all of North America. Let that number settle in your mind. 60 million animals reduced to fewer than 1,000 in roughly 50 years. It was an extinction event engineered by human policy and human greed, unfolding in plain sight. The recovery began almost accidentally. A handful of ranchers and naturalists, including William Hornaday of the New York Zoological Society, began collecting and protecting the last surviving animals in the 1880s and 1890s. They established small breeding herds. In 1905, the American Bison Society was founded. Captive animals were carefully managed and eventually reintroduced to protected ranges across the Great Plains. Today, there are approximately 500,000 bison in North America. Roughly 30,000 of those exist in conservation herds managed specifically to preserve genetic diversity and wild behavior. Yellowstone National Park holds the largest genetically pure wild bison herd, around 5,000 animals that have never been interbred with cattle. Indigenous nations are now leading many of the most ambitious bison restoration projects, returning the animal to tribal lands and reconnecting to traditions that were nearly severed forever. 500,000 bison from fewer than 1,000. It is not yet the thundering mass of 60 million. But it is alive. It is moving. And on the right morning, standing on a ridge in the Dakotas with the wind in your face, you can hear them coming. Our final animal doesn't just have a comeback story. It has a comeback story that changed an entire landscape, literally reshaped rivers, regrew forests, and demonstrated something scientists call a trophic cascade. The gray wolf is the only animal on this list whose return physically altered the geography of the place it came back to. Gray wolves once ranged across virtually all of North America. They were systematically hunted, trapped, and poisoned throughout the 1800s and early 1900s. Ranchers feared them for livestock predation. Government predator control programs paid bounties. By the 1970s, gray wolves had been completely extirpated from the American West outside of Minnesota and a small population in Michigan. Yellowstone National Park, established in 1872 partly to protect wildlife, had no wolves at all. The last confirmed wolf pack in Yellowstone had been killed by park rangers themselves in 1926. For 7 decades, Yellowstone had no wolves, and the absence was slowly dismantling the ecosystem from the inside out. Without predators, elk populations ballooned. They overgrazed riverbanks and valley floors, stripping willows, aspens, and cottonwood trees down to bare soil. Without tree roots, riverbanks eroded. Streams widened and shallowed. Bird species that depended on riverside vegetation disappeared. Beaver populations collapsed because there was no vegetation for them to use. A single missing predator had set off a cascade of ecological collapse across an entire national park. In 1995 and 1996, after years of political battles, scientific debate, and fierce opposition from ranching communities, 41 gray wolves were reintroduced into Yellowstone from Canada. What happened next became one of the most studied ecological events of the 20th century. The wolves immediately began hunting elk, but more importantly, they changed elk behavior. Elk stopped lingering in open valleys and riverbanks where wolves could easily run them down. They began moving more, grazing differently, avoiding certain areas entirely. This behavioral shift, scientists call it the ecology of fear, allowed vegetation to recover in those previously decimated areas. Willows grew back along rivers. Aspens returned to valley floors. Songbirds came back to nest in the new growth. Beavers returned and built dams, which created ponds, which created wetland habitat for fish, amphibians, and migratory birds. The roots of the returning trees stabilized riverbanks. And rivers, actual physical rivers, began to narrow, deepen, and change course in ways that matched historical maps from before the wolves had been removed. The wolves had fixed the rivers, without touching the water once. Today, the Northern Rockies wolf population numbers over 2,000 animals. They are still controversial. Ranchers still lose livestock. Political battles over wolf management continue in Idaho, Montana, and Wyoming. But the science is no longer debatable. When the wolves came back to Yellowstone, the entire ecosystem began to breathe again. And that is the final lesson from all of these animals. They didn't just survive. They reminded us that the world works better when all of its pieces are present. The bald eagle, the humpback whale, the American bison, the gray wolf, 4 animals that were nearly erased and chose, in their own way, to remain. If you found this fascinating, subscribe and hit the bell. And tell us in the comments, which comeback surprised you the most?